Our scripture for the message, we're starting Acts 17, verses 1 through 9. Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as was his custom, and on the 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded, joined Paul and Silas, and did a great many of the devout Jews, and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob. They set the city in an uproar, and they attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring him out into the crowd. Now when they could not find him, they dragged Jason and some of the brethren before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have turned the world upside down have now come down here also, and Jason has received them. They're all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus." The people and the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things, and when they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. It's often been said about Christians throughout the centuries that they are upsetting our whole way of life. Now, this upsetting can either be a good upsetting or a bad upsetting. The bad upsetting would be they're trying to force us to do what they think's best, usually threats concerning salvation. Whenever Christians do this, they forget that their role is to be witnesses of a saving life, not rulers or enforcers of a saving life. Now, a good upsetting would be when we're not trying to force someone, but simply we're living in such a way that our witness shines through, so that other people are hearing, for example, I guess our rules can't change people's hearts. Or maybe others saying, we can't have everything that we dream about because our desires work against each other. When this happens, people can learn to put their trust for life in God instead of in following certain rules or in achieving certain dreams, because those rules and those dreams will always fail us. Jesus' saving way of life is always different than how the world usually thinks, and so it's a good thing that the news of him and his love can upset us. That's what our text is lifting up for us. Paul and Silas come to Thessalonica, and unlike Philippi, there is a Jewish synagogue here, and so Paul joins them for 3 weeks, discussing with them from the Scriptures. And then literally the words used here, when Paul is going to be saying to them, it says he opened and set before them, as if he was opening something precious and setting it before them like this full feast. He opened and set before them that it was necessary for the Messiah to have died and be raised from the dead, and that this is the Messiah, Jesus, whom I'm announcing to you. Now, we're told that some people were persuaded to join Paul and Silas, a great number of pious Greeks and not a few of the leading women. Their lives are upset in a good way. A loving God has shown them a better way of living. Now, the rest of the Jews in the synagogue, though, became jealous, probably because there were many of their God-fearers that had joined their worship are now following this new way. We mentioned it before. God-fearers were Greeks who attended synagogue, but they couldn't sit in the middle seats. So a lot of times there would be porticos on the side, and so they could sit out in those hallways, or if it was an expensive building, it could have a balcony, and they'd get to sit up in the balcony. They weren't fully Jews. They didn't get circumcised. They don't follow all the laws of the Old Testament. They just believe the God of Israel is the one true God, and they try to follow some of the moral laws that are in the Old Testament. A lot of those God-fearers are now listening to this new way and becoming Christians, becoming followers of the way that Paul and Silas are lifting up. So I think there was maybe a certain prestige about having these people in the town being in the synagogue worship, and now they're going to follow this new way. And if I were one of those Jews that didn't follow him, I think I could be thinking, you know, we've been telling them you've got to follow the rules of the law in order to live a better life. And now this other people come along and they say that doesn't work. And we know this because the God of the law, who gave the law, came down and became a human being, and he told us that our trying to keep the law didn't save us. And he himself is the only one who saves us. So if Paul and Silas are right, that means their answer to life is wrong. They don't want to accept that. And so these lawful men resort to unlawful deeds. It says, in jealousy, they gather together some evil men from the marketplace. Marketplace is where all the buying and selling, but also people who were idlers, who didn't have regular jobs, who kind of sit around and talk with each other, and oftentimes when you do that, you get in trouble together, and so sometimes there would be troublemakers. They call them rabble in this translation. But basically, it was easy for these Jews that were jealous to gather together some men, form a mob, and it would disturb the city. They attacked the house of Jason. He must have been one of these new Christians. They were seeking Paul and Silas, but they didn't find them, so they dragged Jason and a few of the other new Christians down to the city authorities. And then they claimed that these men, meaning Paul and Silas, are upsetting the whole world. And now they're present here, and Jason has received them. Well, so far that part's true, but then they go on. All these men act against the decrees of Caesar, saying there's another king, Jesus. So here we have them intentionally twisting the truth. Just because Jesus is king doesn't mean that his followers are going to do anything unlawful, which is what they're claiming by being against all the decrees of Caesar. So it's wrong, but it works. It troubles the authorities and the crowd, we're told, and Jason and the others must post bond, basically, in order to be released and have a trial later, and we're not told in the text what happens with any of that. But it's clear that a majority of the town doesn't want to let go of their own way, their old way of living, even though that old way is harmful to them and the people around them. The Christian message is upsetting, and only some of the people see this as a good thing. The same is true today for us. People are still either relying on rules being enforced, followed, or maybe just pursuing their dreams in order to have a purposeful, meaningful, a saving life. But those pursuits fail us. Only God himself, in Jesus, can lead us in a saving way of living, because he became one of us so that we might become one with him. The good news is that Jesus did come to earth out of love for us to do that very thing. Give us that new saving way of living. Let's hear an example by a woman named Susan Peoples, who learned this in a very traumatic experience. Susan prided herself on her independence, her toughness, she said, the me against the world attitude, and she thought she was winning. She had left home early as a teenager and had several jobs, but this wasn't just going from one to another bad job. These were good jobs. One of them was managing a restaurant. She said, I like being in charge of a business, just like I like being in charge of my own life and destiny. Maybe that's why she found herself climbing a canyon wall in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in northern New Mexico. The challenge suited me. Susan had a climbing partner, David. He could have been more than that. She admired his strength and his agility, but she fought against developing feelings for him. That would only, in her words, invite emotional pain. The kind of pain she saw when her parents divorced when she was a child. I decided to keep everyone at a distance, surrounding myself by an invisible wall. I would shut out all emotion and become totally self-sufficient. As they climbed further up that wall, it was getting closer to vertical. So an angle at first and going straight to vertical. Only about 30 feet left of the 200 feet to go. The shelf of rock, which Susan had tested and put her hand on, suddenly gave way. She dropped into space, and big chunks of rock were following her in the air. David screamed, "My God, oh my God." Everything was going in slow motion for Susan. God was something else when she heard David say that name, that something else that she had shut out of her life. All my growing years, she said, I had attended a strict religious school where teachers described God as an angry and vengeful being who would send me to hell for my sins, and I wanted no part of him. She had rather assume responsibility for her own actions than cower in fear of a cruel judge. As Susan was falling, she kept hearing David crying out God's name. She said some strange things immediately began to happen. Normally, when something would break away like that, you go away from the cliff face and you're just way out in space in the middle. But she said her body suddenly twisted and turned, and she was actually falling next to the cliff face. As she was going down, her feet twice hit small protrusions, and then they landed on the only ledge between her and the ground, barely wide enough to hold one person. She sat down with her legs dangling over the edge. The rock from that first shelf should have crushed her. She said it was several cubic feet, but inexplicably at the last minute it veered off to the right and only grazed her shoulder. And then she looked and watched the rock fall 150 feet below on the canyon floor. David made his way over to her. "Thank God you're alive," he said, but then he groaned. "Susan, your leg." She looked and her left leg was shattered. In 3 places she could see bones sticking through. And she didn't want to look at it, so she turned her head to the right, only to see that her right arm had been slit open all the way from her elbow to her wrist. And she could see her veins and see her tendons and muscles there, and blood was coming out. David said there was no way he could get her down off the cliff alone, so he would have to go and get help. Susan said the initial shock was starting to wear off and the pain began. "Hurry," was all she said. As he went away, she thought that it was the nearest hospital was 20 miles away. She knew it would take hours, and it was getting dark and cold. The pain increased and an icy rain began. The ledge became slick, and Susan had to concentrate all her strength in her left arm just to hold herself there on this ledge. It would have been so easy to let go and slip into that void. She had recently, though, read a book, and maybe you had read it, Life After Life, back in the 70s or 80s. It's a book about near-death experiences and people seeing this being of light and love. And so she found herself all of a sudden praying to that kind of a God for strength. And after a moment or two, she said, suddenly he came. I saw no light. I heard no voice. All I can tell you is that suddenly beside me on that ledge, there was a presence filled with warmth and love. I could feel strength pouring into me from that presence, joining with and energizing my own fading will. thought she could hear in her mind had her own voice, but she heard those thoughts say, "Hold on, you can make it. You are not alone." The comfort, she said, was indescribable. But after a few minutes of being in this presence, she began to wish she could feel a human touch. Her keeping people away all these years was now making her feel an inner pain as she's in the midst of this loving presence. Time blurred for her and the night went on, and as she was trying to stay awake, she thought she could maybe hear somebody calling her name in the distance, and she looked down over the ledge, and there was this little light that seemed to be going back and forth on the canyon floor. So she called back, and it would call her name again, and so they kept kind of calling back and forth, and the little light ascended up the cliff face. It turned out to be a boy, 12 or 13 years old, had a blanket over his shoulder. He put it over her. It turned out David had stumbled onto their house looking for a phone, but found none and left to go further, and yet had briefly told what had happened. This boy, Michael, had thought she might be cold and came to her. "What else can I do to help you?" he asked. "Elevate my arms," she said. She thought maybe too much bleeding and needed to elevate it, but when he did so, she saw that it had clotted and it wasn't bleeding anymore. But that lifting her arm up started to make her slip, and he had to grab a hold of both of her shoulders and hold on. He talked to her to keep her awake for 2 hours on that ledge. Then David appeared finally with a doctor and 2 paramedics. It took several more hours to get her off of the cliff. And when the thought occurred to her that their lives were in danger, she changed her prayer to, "Please, God, don't let one of them die on that cliff for helping me." Well, make a long story short, 12 hours later, she was in surgery in a hospital, and when she woke, she was immobilized with large casts on her arm and leg. Me, Miss Independent, totally helpless and having to rely on others. Dozens of flower arrangements, hundreds of cards, and visitors. One of them saying to her, "You've always been such a loner, Susan, holding us off, and at last, we're going to get to do something for you." The God I met on that ledge, she said, was neither angry nor condemning. The God I met there was love. Love flowing from an unseen presence, and then from David and a rescue team, and then from a boy, Michael. When that rock fell, so did the wall that I built around myself to shut out that love. I will never be the same. A life upset by the gospel of Jesus. As Christians, we upset the world, not by trying to force them to do what we think's best, but simply by being witnesses of a better, saving way of life. That way of life all comes from Jesus, the God who loves us and became one of us in order that we could become one with him. For now, he's an invisible presence to us, and yet, like Susan, loving us, teaching us to love others. So let us upset the world with the good news of Jesus' love.